the news is just like a fire hose. It is just like a fire hose. So take a deep breath if you need to. And it is, as I say, okay to look away and go do something else. But I will do what I can to make some sense out of it for you today. And once again, it seems to me that the things that people have asked about are all over the map. So, I want to suggest a larger lens to look at what's happening in the United States right now because it might help a little bit to see the bigger picture and to be able to fit things into a framework. And what I want to talk about today to fit these things into a framework is the concept of freedom. You know, a lot of people talk about freedom, and I'm going to talk about that some today. But actually defining what freedom is a different thing. And so I want to talk about freedom in two ways today. That is freedom from things and freedom to do things. So, freedom from and freedom to. And those are really very different things that I think make a lot of sense in this moment if you can distinguish between the two. So, let's start with the idea of freedom from things, because this has been really the rallying cry of the radical right now for at least 40 years that Americans have freedom, and freedom should mean to have freedom from things, freedom from government oversight. And one of the big stories from today is that Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. testified before the Senate Finance Committee, and it was very contentious. A lot of raised voices, a lot of disagreement about basic facts. And one of the pieces that Kennedy was standing on was the idea that Americans should have freedom from government oversight of their medical care. So, for example, he's an anti vaxxer for a number of different reasons in his own personal makeup. And I've written about those before. He doesn't appear to believe in germ theory as a driver of disease. And like I say, you can look through my old writings about that. But in this moment, he is part of a movement that wants the United States government to stop overseeing people's health, especially through things like vaccines. And so yesterday, today's Thursday, right? So yesterday, Florida became the first state in the union to say that children that there are no requirements for having vaccines to go to public school. And it's really interesting that Florida did this. I mean, it's not a surprise Florida did this because of the degree to which Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida has embraced some of the radical right movement. But it's interesting that the children in Florida will no longer be required to have vaccines to go to public school, considering the fact that a key moneymaker in Florida are theme parks, especially Disney theme park, and those are places that are inhabited, or that are attractions to children. And if you are thinking about where you're going to take your children during spring break or during the school vacations, it probably is not going to make you more likely to go to Florida to learn that they're going to be with a population that has not been vaccinated or has the potential not to have been vaccinated against childhood diseases. Now, the other thing that's interesting about that position on the part of Florida is that more than 80% of Americans want there to be childhood vaccines, want them to be required, especially for things like polio, of course, and measles and whooping cough, the diseases that people still seem to recognize as being enormously dangerous, because they are. But the Kennedy impulse is to say that the government should get out of your faces, that they believe in freedom from government intervention. And as I say, it's really interesting because that has been a piece that the radical right has pushed now for 40 years, that we need a really small government, that you can drown in a bathtub. You've heard all of these things, because that's the only thing that is going to permit Americans truly to be free. But one of the reasons that's interesting in this moment is, in fact, well, Trump and people like Kennedy talk about freedom, and Trump talks about it a lot with regard to getting rid of regulations so business people can drill for oil, for example. In fact, the Trump administration has been using the state in really intrusive ways. So they're talking about freedom, but the other big piece of news from today is the fact that the Trump administration appears to have launched a military strike against a small boat with 11 people on it, civilians, that they allege anyway. I mean, it's very unclear to me how anybody knows any of this, and they're saying they're not saying, but they're alleging that these were Venezuelan drug traffickers. And there's a lot of problems with that story to begin with, not least that there appears to be no legal justification for it. But it's a really big deal because it is first of all, we're not at war with Venezuela, and you can't attack civilians, and the government should not attack civilians, and the military should not have attacked civilians. There is a bit of doubt as to whether or not this ever happened. Venezuela says that this is AI and this event never happened. I think there's just a lot of opaqueness over this, but the administration is putting forward the idea that it, in fact, attacked civilians from another country and essentially murdered them in cold blood, even though normally under international law, when they want to stop a drug that they suspect is smuggling, a boat that they suspect is smuggling drugs, they shoot the engine. I mean, this is like a no-brainer. If you've ever been out in a boat, especially in a boat with a small engine, you put any kind of a monkey wrench in a small engine, that sucker's not going anywhere. So what normally happens is they stop the boat, they round the people up, and they take them to the nearest port to be charged. So the fact that the government is asserting that it has the right summarily to execute people that they say are drug dealers, it is not really possible to think of a more overreach of a government. And again, I'm sort of thinking about this philosophically, of a government than simply saying, we, the government, can take your life. So for a party that has always stood for freedom from government, we now have a Republican president in power who says, I have the power to take your life if I think it's the right thing to do, which is hardly freedom from the government. But it's not just that. Trump has really gotten rid of a lot of those central tenets of what used to be the Republican concept of freedom. He has started to put the military in US cities and claimed the right to do that. Now he's backing off a bit on that, as J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, and has been standing up to him and saying, you are not welcome. I'm going on record that you are not supposed to do this, because of course he's not supposed to go into another state without the governor of the state requesting him to go in, which is why Trump is now saying, all these people should be requesting me. But Pritzker has pushed back. So has California Governor Gavin Newsom, who has been mocking Trump and has won against him in court, where a court decided in California that, in fact, by using the nationalized federal guard and using the Marines in Los Angeles broke the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. So as there has been pushback, now you can see Trump sort of saying, well, they should all ask me. I want to be asked. They should all ask me. And some of the Republican governors may go ahead and do that. But that idea of freedom from the government, he's completely blowing that up with the idea that literally the government is putting troops into cities, which doesn't exactly illustrate freedom from something, which may be one of the reasons that the juries in Washington, D.C., the grand juries in Washington, D.C., and grand juries are enormously stacked against defendants, have refused to indict the defendants, in part probably because they at some level feel that the government is exercising overreach here, like, for example, their attempt to get a felony assault conviction on the guy who threw a sandwich. That seems like it was a bit much. But the administration is also exercising that kind of power over children. And again, if you're thinking about freedom from something, the idea that the Trump administration rounded up children in the middle of the night and put them on planes unaccompanied, people as young as 10, to send them to Guatemala. Um, Again, that's not freedom from something. That is an extremely heavy-handed government. And you're also seeing Trump rejecting this concept of freedom from the government with his tariffs, which a second court has now found illegal. But the idea behind the Republican movement since at least the 1980s was really to double down on the idea of free markets, that the government would not get involved in how people managed their money and managed industry, and that that would be the most efficient way to run a society. And now Trump is jumping into the middle of that and not only saying that he's going to put up these tariff walls that are dramatically reordering world, but especially American economy, but also that he was going to take a cut of certain parts of companies as well, and have a say in how those companies operate. So that idea of freedom from things that the Republicans clung to so tightly has really just evaporated under Trump. And I think that's a really interesting change that we have had. And it also is reflected in the rise of Project 2025 and the radical religious right in a way that is important. That is, one of the arguments that the religious radicals make is that the idea of freedom from government, which you saw with with this idea that people should have equal rights for example, but that people should be able to behave as they want, has in their minds led the United States down a bad path. An argument similar to what Vladimir Putin has made in Russia and Viktor Orban has made in Hungary, because what it's permitted is the visibility of LGBTQ plus people, of women wanting rights, of minority ethnic, religious, gender, and racial minorities wanting rights, and those things are in their minds corrupting society. And what the argument is among those who adhere to this radical religion is that because people don't have the ability to regulate their own behavior, you need to have a strong religious component in society to make sure that they behave as they should, which again is exactly contrary to the idea of freedom from overreach by the government. So, on the one hand, you have that concept of freedom from the government, which has been the driving force behind the Republicans and has been really a driving force of the anti-vax movement. And you've got at the same time Trump and the people he has surrounding him pushing this extraordinarily strong government, which is the exact opposite of freedom from the government. But now there's another kind of freedom that is very much in play with this argument about vaccines, but in American history in general. And that's the concept of freedom to. Now, one of the people who early articulated this difference between freedom from and freedom to didn't really talk about the government. When he talked about it, what he said was that freedom too is about individual self actualization. That is, who do you want to be? What do you have the freedom to be? But the trick to that in the United States, really since Theodore Roosevelt, the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 until well, I can't do the math, 1901 for 9, is right, because he leaves office and Taft comes in. All right, so the since Theodore Roosevelt, who's a Republican, by the way, that idea of freedom to has depended on a government that protects the individual, which is the concept of which is where it dovetails with the idea of liberalism, the protection of individual rights, which is a pretty new concept in the 19th century. And that idea of a government that protects the ability of individuals to make something of themselves, whatever they choose to make of themselves, is a really important concept for the figuring out what the good role, what the true role of the US government should be in society. So If the government is supposed to protect freedom, your freedom to become a doctor or a lobsterman or whatever you want to be, the government should be protecting your health, for example. It should make sure you don't die of childhood diseases if it has the ability to do that, which is where we get the government requirements for vaccines, which really take off, by the way, in the late 19th century. The idea that we are going to protect the public in general so that people in the public have the ability and have the freedom to go on and have a healthy life. Similarly, the idea of freedom to do things is going to mean that the government's going to protect education. It's going to protect access to resources. It's going to make sure that your food's not adulterated with formaldehyde and chalk and the things they used to put in milk. It's going to mean that you're going to be protected from workplace accidents. It's going to make sure that there are protections in place that enable people to do things, have the freedom to do things. And that idea of freedom to is the idea behind civil rights legislation and what is now denigrated as diversity, equity, inclusion. But all what it is called DEI does is it makes sure that everybody has the freedom to do things. And so if you think about what I just laid out, freedom from is often embraced by people with power, especially by white men and white men who run businesses, because they don't want government to be messing around with them. They want to do whatever they want. Freedom to do things. So freedom, they want freedom from. Freedom to do things is usually people who are not in power, usually people who are marginalized for one reason or another, and need to have government step in to give them the freedom to do things. So one of the things that we're seeing right now is the the struggle in our society between freedom from and freedom to. And one of the ways this is playing out is, well, it's playing out on the national level through things like soybeans, where the idea of freedom from government interference, which is what a lot of people voted for, has now turned into the fact that China is boycotting US soybeans because of Trump's trade wars, among other things. And so the farmers are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. We want the freedom to sell our soybeans. So they've gone from not wanting government intervention to wanting the government to make it possible for them to sell their soybeans, which is actually what was going on before, but that's not the way the rhetoric worked. So you're seeing it over things like that, but you're also seeing it in the question that most of you asked. And that was about soft secession, which is a term that is out there. Don't get all excited about that term. The idea of, or you can if you want, but this is nothing new. The idea that states can take different positions than the federal government has been part of our history since the early 1800s. And its early incarnation in the 1830s, its real political articulation under Andrew Jackson before he became president, um, was an attempt of the Southern enslavers to legitimize a society in which, even though most Americans did not want the continuation of American enslavement and the amassing of property that it permitted a few people to do in the American South, that resting on the idea that states could do things differently than the federal government um, is one of the ways that they managed to justify and to protect the perpetuation of human enslavement. So that idea of the states doing something different has a really negative start in our history. But since then, states have always used it in positive ways as well. So, really, even before Andrew Jackson starts talking about the use of states' rights, you see it in places like New York, the state of New York, where at a time when the federal government said we're not going to get involved in internal improvements because the elite enslavers don't want us to, or rather, they're still arguing about it in the 1820s. New York State says, hey, we're in. We're going to improve our own state, whether or not you want to go along with it, and that's where you get the Erie Canal. which is finished in 1825. I mean, and they built that sucker with shovels through the state of New York to make sure that the middle part of the country didn't break off from the United States and join Canada, which it would have because of the way the rivers run. But as early as the 1820s, the state of New York is saying, you don't want to do internal improvements? Okay, we're going to do it ourselves. But even more dramatically than that, in the late 19th century, when the federal government was taken over, let's call them the robber barons, was taken over by the Republican Party, and they were not going to do anything to help ordinary Americans. States, primarily states like Wisconsin, if you've ever heard of the Wisconsin plan, but the state of Wisconsin and New York as well, but the state of Wisconsin becomes it is literally called a laboratory for democracy. That same idea gets picked up as well in New York State in the same period, in the state of New York, when Tammany Hall, which is running New York City, needs to find a legitimate way because they're no longer corrupt to get people to vote for them, and they start to protect the rights of ordinary Americans living in New York City, to the point that in the 1900s they are already protecting women's rights and Black rights, which is kind of eye-popping if you think about it, because on the national level, the opposite was happening, but the state of New York was working to do those things. And it's actually from the state of New York that we get the rise of the New Deal, an attempt to take that system national for the New Deal. And that is, of course, what the radical right is trying to get rid of now. But you also see after the initial New Deal under Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, the idea that the federal government is going to take those good ideas from the states and create mandates, federally funded mandates for different states to do things for their citizens, with the idea that, of course, every state would like for things to be good for their citizens, but some are richer than others. So the federal government would give money to those states until they could get their acts together to be able to provide education or to provide some of the things that the federal government thought were useful for everybody to do. So the idea that that states are going to start doing things that the federal government is not at all a new idea. And what you're really seeing over these over vaccines is this idea that different states are going to say, we don't know what on earth the Secretary Kennedy is going to be doing at the CDC. He seems to be decimating it with this concept of you should have the freedom from the government to make your own healthcare decisions. But we in our states are going to give you the freedom to be protected from polio and COVID-19 and the diseases that we do have vaccines to combat. So I think you're seeing a switch from where we have been in the past, really since World War II in this country, where the federal government has really tried to do the thing that is best for the most people, to embrace science, to make it easier for people to have freedom to do things. And now the federal government is both cutting back on that and creating this extraordinarily heavy-handed government that no longer is exercising freedom from government for the people in the cities where there are deportations and the sweeps and all that. But the states are embracing the Democratic dominated states are embracing the concept that we have freedom to do things, and that I think is a really important difference when you think about what you want the government to do, because right now it certainly appears as if the federal government is saying you have, business people who don't want regulations have freedom from the government, and people who don't want vaccines have freedom from the government. But those of you who are not doing what we want don't have any of those freedoms from the government. In fact, we've got the most heavy-handed government we've ever had. And this is obviously a recipe for authoritarianism. But just as deeply in American history as as the freedom from government, we have a government that has said we have freedom to do things. We have freedom to build the Erie Canal. We have freedom to have food that is not polluted, to have clean water, to have clean air, to have access to health care, which Theodore Roosevelt was the first to bring up in the 1900s, to have education, to have science-based medicine. Those are things we have freedom to have. And one of the things that I'm seeing is in the sort of murky, this is happening, so and so is pushing that, is it feels like it would be useful to break those two things apart and stop being wedded to this idea that the government needs to stay out of our lives because otherwise we are losing our freedom. And instead, to embrace the idea that there are some places in which we very much need the government to be included in our lives because we need the freedom to go to Disney World or whichever one it is in Florida. I can never remember which, without worrying that your kid's going to get polio. I mean, one of the things that people don't remember today is that the summers, it used to be considered incredibly deadly because that's when the polio virus was most prevalent and easiest to pick up. Remember, FDR gets polio as an adult during the summer up at Campobello Island up the coast from me. So it feels like those two things would be important to remember when you're looking at all the very many things that are slamming into us today and have been slamming into us because at the same time that Trump is using the government in an incredibly heavy-handed way, there's also an argument to be made that we actually want a government that does things to enable us to have the freedom to achieve who we want to be. And I just felt today like a lot of people weren't talking about that, and like it was an important place for us to be. And I think you're seeing that in JB Pritzker and his pushback against Trump's threats to invade. You're certainly seeing it in the different states getting together to make vaccines available and so on. One of the things that jumped out today about the hearing that had Kennedy at the Senate Finance Committee, and with some of the other stories we're hearing now from James McGovern of Massachusetts, for example, about why Republicans voted in favor of the budget reconciliation bill known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, um, is that a lot of Republicans don't like those things either. They recognize both that Kennedy is destroying our public health system and that the budget reconciliation bill is going to badly hurt a number of Americans. Far more than the Republicans seem to have banked on when they pushed it through. They knew it was going to hurt. They knew Kennedy. They know Kennedy is bad news for the public health, but they don't dare to stand up to Trump, for which I have zero patience. Nobody asked them to take those jobs. They ran for those jobs. That being said, the best way for Americans to push back against what is happening right now is to make it very clear that it is better to risk Trump's wrath of being primaried than it is to risk the wrath of the voters. And, the more people speak up, the more people are on those overpasses, the more people are turning out in the streets, the more people are writing to their Congress people, but also their state legislators and showing up there, especially in Republican dominated or purple states, because Trump is pushing so hard for the redistricting of those states, and it'll be state lawmakers who do that. The more people push back, the more you're going to see things like, for example, Joni Ernst deciding that she is not going to run for reelection in Iowa. You're seeing a lot of people who are now at the national level deciding they're going to go back to the state level because they're worried about what's happening at the national level. The more we speak up, and it's hard now. It is so overwhelming. Like I thought I was good on the news today at about 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And then I had meetings from 3 to 6. And by the time I looked at the news at 5:45, it was crazy. It was a whole different day. It gets overwhelming. It is okay to take a break. But one of the reasons I just gave you that really broad framing to fit things into is because sometimes you just can't follow everything that's happening. And it helps to think, is this an issue on which I need freedom from the government? For example, about your healthcare decisions and for your reproductive health care, for example? Or is this someplace where I need freedom to do things like for vaccines? So one would think that there might be a boilerplate for both of those issues, but there really aren't. Because at the end of the day, what you're protecting in the United States of America is the ability of individuals to determine their own future. And sometimes, in order to do that, we need the government to stay away from us. We don't need to have a government that's going to shoot us in the streets or have troops in the streets or decide whether or not we can have reproductive health care. We do need to have a government that's going to make it possible for people to get educations and that are going to make it possible for us not to get shot in the streets. So it's worth thinking about freedom from and freedom to when you're thinking about what we want the future to look like, because we've got to be thinking about that as Trump and the MAGAs try to claim more and more power because they know how weak they are in terms of popularity in the country.